The views expressed in this blog are hosted on my own website, are strictly personal, and do not reflect the views of any organization. Hello and welcome once again to Straight Bat, my weekly video blog where, as the title suggests, I comment with a straight bat. Now, it's often said one man's terrorist can be another person's freedom fighter. It's a contentious view, also a bit of a cliche, but one that can also blur the realities. Take the case this week of Yasin Malik, the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front leader who's just been sentenced to life imprisonment in a case involving terror funding. How does one actually describe or introduce Yasin Malik is a question that has often troubled journalists and scholars. Is he a separatist whose organization has openly advocated for azaadi for the Kashmir Valley? Should he be seen as a terrorist who has participated and engaged in acts of violence against non-combatants? Is he a militant who has aggressively espoused a particular cause? Or is he, as he likes to describe himself, a reformed man of Gandhian values who has given up his violent past? I guess how you perceive a Yasin Malik depends on which side of the ideological political fence you lie. But let me explain just why definitions can get complicated. Now, I traveled first as a journalist to the Kashmir Valley during the Hazrat Bal siege in 1993, when terrorism was still being seen by many in the valley as a largely indigenous Kashmiri struggle. The terrorists were clearly sponsored by Pakistan with arms and money, but they were seen by the local population often more as freedom fighters than as mercenaries who would later pour in from across the border and completely change the battle into a bloody war against the Indian state. I recall doing a broadcast sometime in 1995 and referring to a group which had just kidnapped foreign tourists and calling them terrorists. I got a call from a friend in Srinagar to tell me to please avoid using the word terrorist. Please use the word militant Rajdeep at all times. When you're in the valley, if you call them terrorists, there will be those who will accuse you of being an Indian army agent. I was young, relatively inexperienced, and was unsure at the time of what exactly my friend meant, but soon realized that those who I saw as terrorists were often seen in a completely different perspective by the local population. This was especially true of those whose roots were firmly in the valley, who had taken to the gun after taking political positions. At the time, they were seen to be fighting a so-called just war for azaadi. The JKLF, comprising many young Kashmiris, therefore, was seen very differently to the way that the Pakistan-based groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed would be seen in the later years of terrorism. Very few I have ever met in the valley over the years have any real sympathy for the Lashkar and Jaish operatives. With the JKLF, on the other hand, especially in the early 90s, it was very different. They were seen as flag bearers of a new Kashmiri identity, even if that identity was tragically soaked in blood, including of fellow Kashmiris. This is where I think Yasin Malik fits in his original avatar. Remember, Yasin earned his spurs as a student leader in the restive 1980s. He was an active member of the Islamic Students League that joined hands to support the Muslim United Front, or MUF, to contest the contentious 1987 elections in Jammu and Kashmir. Yasin was then the election agent of Mohammad Yusuf Shah of the MUF, who was contesting from the Amira Kadal constituency in Srinagar. By all accounts, Shah was winning the elections by a landslide when suddenly the result was reversed and most people claimed that the election had been rigged for the benefit of the National Conference. Yusuf Shah and Yasin were arrested that very night, allegedly beaten up badly in jail, kept in jail till the end of 1987. Once released, the duo crossed over to Pakistan. Yusuf Shah, who was a local peer at the time, would later transform himself into Sayyid Salahuddin, the chief of the dreaded Hizbul Mujahideen, while Yasin became part of the JKLF and received arms training in Pakistan. Now, between 1989 and 1994, it was the JKLF that was one of the principal groups operating in the valley, getting arms and ammunition from Pakistan, but also local support. Many of the attacks on the security forces and indeed citizens in this period was directed by the JKLF. Yasin was part of these operations in some form or the other, make no mistake. He was arrested by the security forces in August 1990, that fateful year when the Kashmiri Pandit upheaval also took place in the valley. By 1994, though, he was out of jail on bail and was calling for a ceasefire. This is when, my friends, I met Yasin for the first time. I remember he was a very thin, scrawny presence with the beard there, mumbling out his words and never really smiling at any time. He insisted that he had decided to shun the path of violence. I want to ensure that Kashmiris get their rights in a peaceful, democratic manner. He actually claimed to me that he wanted to follow a Gandhian way of approaching the Kashmir dispute. I must confess I was hugely skeptical because, as my sources in the security agencies at the time maintained, Yasin was still very much in touch with terror operatives both within and outside the valley. My own sense is that it isn't Yasin who suddenly changed as much as the shifting ground realities in the valley. Because when you look at how things were changing in the second half of the 1990s, the aggressive security forces operations meant that several of Yasin's closest aides were either killed or captured. The Pakistanis had begun to train and push in their own operatives, many of whom had fought the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The likes of Mast Gul, who was involved in the 1995 siege of Charare Sharif, were hardened terrorists who didn't have any time for politics or political dialogue. The JKLF itself was splintered and divided by this time, and I think Yasin somewhere realized that the only way he could survive and forge a distinct identity for himself was to enter the political process as the so-called reformed separatist. It was, some would argue, opportunistic, but I thought it was also a welcome shift in approach. And let me be clear, and I think this is important to emphasize. Successive Indian governments realized that they needed to somehow co-opt at the time a large section of these separatists and slowly break Islamabad's hold over them. And when I say successive governments here, I refer, my friends, both to the Vajpayee government that was in power from 1998 to 2004 and the Manmohan Singh government that followed. That's right, my friends. There is a picture of Dr. Singh doing the rounds with Yasin Malik, which the BJP says is proof that the Congress-led UPA was ready to negotiate with the separatists. But let's be clear, while that is absolutely right, the truth that is often forgotten or deliberately ignored is that this process of giving Yasin Malik an image makeover, a legitimacy of sorts, is not something that started during the UPA years. The baby steps were taken in 1995 when Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister, continued through the Devagowda Gujral interlude, and got a fresh impetus when the Vajpayee government decided to formally open talks with the separatist Hurriyat Conference. Yes, there is no photo op of Mr. Vajpayee with Yasin Malik as there is of Dr. Singh, but ask any security official during that period and they will tell you that the Indian government at the time saw Yasin as a possible interlocutor among the others within the Hurriyat. Nor was Yasin seen as a genuine peacenik only by the JNU left liberal activists who are today routinely attacked as anti-nationals. Amongst Yasin's biggest advocates at the time was the Manushi editor, academic Madhu Kishwar, who would later, of course, transform herself into a staunch Modi supporter. Madhu, like so many other members of the Indian intelligentsia at the time, saw Yasin as someone who they could build a dialogue with, and she even organized seminars where he was the star speaker. Which is why when today the Modi government has chosen to take a more hardline approach on Yasin Malik, I am not surprised that the likes of Madhu Kishwar stay silent. I would love to know, in fact, that how those who engaged with him both within and outside the establishment see Yasin today. Is he seen as a terrorist, a separatist, or a reformed Gandhian militant? Don't forget that this is the same government that today looks to strike deals with Naga militants. Should we be calling them terrorists? That has encouraged other militants, terrorists in the northeast to surrender and be rehabilitated, but will make Yasin Malik the poster boy of Kashmiri terrorism. Why don't we call those in the northeast terrorists as well? My own view, my friends, is that Yasin must pay the price for his role in the crimes, whether direct or indirect, in the JKLF years of terror and violence in the early 1990s. That the Gandhian garb sits uneasily on him because he has never fully repudiated the merchants of terror who operate in the valley, or indeed their benefactors across the valley in Pakistan. I remember interviewing Yasin Malik during Kashmir's violent summer of 2010, when you will recall the street protests that took place. He then got increasingly angry with me because I kept asking him to outrightly condemn Pakistan's role in inciting the violence. Soon after, he and other Kashmiri separatists were typically put under house arrest. Truth, my friends, is we've always had a blow hot, blow cold policy, or the Indian state has had, to Yasin Malik and his ilk. Today the Modi government is talking tough. But I ask this question: will tough talk alone end the cycle of terror in the valley in the absence of a genuine, meaningful dialogue with all the stakeholders? I rather doubt it. Think about it. That was the Straight Bat. Do, of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel for many more such videos. For now, stay well, stay safe. Jai Hind, Namaskar.